Hello, welcome to the second Q&A for Museum Remix. It's very exciting. We're in the middle of our second challenge now, which is 2D visual arts. The challenge closes on the 13th of August, so please do check out the museum's website, the UCM website at museums.cam.ac.uk for full details on the challenge and to sign up. I'm joined today by Eleanor Wilkinson from the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology and Sade Ojelade from the Museum of Classical Archaeology. Those are mouthfuls to say at the best of times. If you've got any questions for us during this Q&A, please feel free to put a comment in the YouTube channel, or if you don't have a YouTube account, to tweet us at CamUnivMuseums, and the handle for that will be in the description box below. So welcome, guys, and thank you for agreeing to participate. So I've got a few questions for you, and then we're going to open up to some questions from the audience. But first off, can you tell me who you are, what you do for the museums, and we'll go from there. So I think Sade first, and then Eleanor.
Okay, so I'm Museum and Collections Assistant at the Museum of Classical Archaeology. So I do lots of stuff, so mainly front of house, but I also kind of do the design work for the museum and any kind of collection projects where you work with volunteers. So it's a really varied role and you kind of do everything. It's because it's so small. So yeah.
Hi there, my name's Eleanor and I'm the Teaching and Collections Assistant for Archaeology at MAA. We just say MAA because it's a mouthful. And again, my role is really varied as well. So I do anything from collections care, look after researchers, install exhibitions, but I also help students access and engage with the collections as part of their courses. So quite varied.
Fantastic. Sounds like there's not sort of a standard day at all for either of you, really.
I know at all.
Brilliant. Well, thanks as well for you've both provided objects for Museum Remix. Eleanor, can you tell us a little bit about the object that you've chosen, which is this beautiful plate with British Sign Language on it?
Yes, so it's a child's plate. It's quite small. And as you say, it's got the British Sign Language alphabet transferred on the centre of it, around a picture of some wooden dolls that all sat around a book. I like to think that they may be having a class themselves. So, and it's quite an unusual piece. We don't have anything else that's similar in our collection or on display that I know of. And I pass this object when I'm in the museum nearly every day. It's on display on the ground floor. And so it was just, this remix is a great opportunity for me to learn more about what we've got on display and find those other narratives that the objects can tell and the stories that can tell. So yeah, it's very small, it's ceramic, quite a few cracks and holes, I'm afraid, but it's been reconstructed beautifully. So yeah, it's an interesting piece that we haven't really explored yet as a museum.
Cool. It is really lovely, and please go check out the video of it if you're after this, of course. Sade, well, how about you? You've got a figurine from, is it Naucratis?
Yeah, Naucratis, it's Roman Egypt. So like Eleanor's, it's really small, but we don't actually have like any objects like that on display. We've only got 4 objects that are kind of similar, and that's the only one, and it's not on the shop, on the gallery floor or anything like that. I think it's quite interesting because it just raises loads of questions that maybe we don't always ask when we're looking at classical art. And I think it's meant to depict an individual. In the catalogues, it's described as an African man or possibly a Numidian, but I think even just exploring the way in which we've described it is actually quite useful and helpful in understanding the populations of the Roman world in a way that maybe we don't tend to look into normally.
Great. And how did you come across it?
Searching the catalogues. I've kind of been quite interested in race and the way in which it's depicted and how we understand it in classics, and also this idea of kind of Roman and non-Roman faces and how we reach those conclusions. So I searched the catalogue for African figurines or anything that depicted an African or any kind of associated words, and we got 4 objects back, and ones that we don't ever really look at or focus on. So it's quite interesting to be able to dive into it and kind of explore it a little bit more.
That's fascinating. I remember during my undergrad, I looked at representations of the classical world on film, and the discrepancies between, you know, what we were presented as the idealized Roman figures and actually possibly what the realities of Roman society were.
Yeah.
Two very different things.
Different things completely, yeah.
Okay, so why did you want to be involved in Remix? Charlie, since I'm talking to you right now, I'll lead with you and then Eleanor.
Okay. So I think it's a really interesting project completely. I think museums really need to be at the forefront of kind of increasing representation and kind of telling the stories that we just haven't told in the past. And I think this is a great way to do it. I think personal responses give you a more kind of rounded view. So when you look at an object, you might see something or see important stories, whereas if someone else looks at it, you get a completely different viewpoint. And I think that's really wonderful to include in your interpretation. Yeah, I think it's really great.
And is that the same sort of thing for you, Eleanor, or anything else?
Yeah, I completely agree. One object can be looked at from so many different perspectives, and it can actually tell so many different stories. And you know, we don't have enough space in our labels to properly explain all the different kind of layers to an object. You know, 30 words doesn't give us a lot to play with, and so sometimes stories might have to take a back seat to others. And so the thing about this remix, it means that we can actually kind of tell another story in a different way, so outside the traditional labels, so we can actually present these objects from a different viewpoint that's not necessarily seen in the display cases or in the catalogue. So that's why I really wanted to, you know, talk about the objects part remix. I've never done a remix activity before, so I really relish this opportunity to kind of give another layer to an object.
Fantastic. So building on that then, can I just ask, you say that sort of labels basically aren't enough, you know, 30 words is not quite enough to delve into these sort of complex histories. Is there a kind of dream scenario of the kinds of information or the kinds of ways of getting visitors to access this information that you have? You know, is it that you want to present music or you want to present videos, anything? Sort of, do you have any ideas on that?
I think it's trying to find like this blended engagement. So it could be the object physically in the museum, but can we use other platforms like social media or virtual 3D modeling, so people can, you know, rotate the objects on their screen. But it's also an opportunity that we can get other interpretations and other media. And so if someone wants to create a performative piece based on our objects, and we can kind of learn from their interpretation and what it means to them, I think being able to kind of build these layers to an object, because as you say, labels can be quite limiting. We could write, you know, an essay on every single object and still not cover everything. So yeah, it's kind of this blended approach, using different ways to kind of learn and communicate and kind of build up the story of an object.
I think that's great. Maybe we'll leave the performative storytelling for a future challenge down the line. Wouldn't that be fantastic? I'm going to ask Jen, my glamorous assistant Jennifer, to pop up for a second with images of these two wonderful objects, which we realised that you couldn't see at the moment. So here they are, and I think she's going to stay on screen for now, so you can actually see what we're talking about when we talk about them. So I guess building on this ideal wants and needs, Sade, what would you like to see remixers doing in response to your object?
I think it's such an open question. I think
it's a hugely open question.
No, it's brilliant. I don't think I'm expecting anything, because I feel like when I watched the audio submission, or listened rather to the audio submissions, they just weren't what I was expecting to come out of it. And I think that was, and I loved all of them. I thought they were all really beautiful and amazing. So I think I'm trying to keep a really open mind, because the ways in which I would respond to these objects, I'm sure will be completely different to the ways other people will. So yeah, I don't think I really expect anything from this. I think I want it to be open, and I want people to kind of do whatever they like. Yeah.
Amazing. How about you, Eleanor?
Yeah, I completely agree. The responses so far have been brilliant, and they've ranged in a way that I couldn't have imagined. From monologues to, there was a song about one of them. One of them was just the typing of a typewriter, which I thought was very, very clever. So yeah, it's going to be great to actually learn how people interpret these objects, and it could go in so many different directions. As we mentioned earlier, performance would be quite interesting to see. But yeah, it's just really to hear other people's perspectives. So I'd be really intrigued at how it moves forward.
Yeah, I mean, having sort of been through one challenge now, it is just, the world is open, you know. There was so many different things came in through just audio that, oh, we've got so much more to come. Very exciting. Okay, I've got some questions from the audience now, which is fantastic. My other glamorous assistant, Hannah, is feeding them to me. So this one's for Eleanor. The plate is old, but nowhere near as old as Sade's figurine. When does an object become archaeology? Actually, I guess it is for both of you.
Goodness, that's quite a hard question. People will have probably very different views of how you determine what archaeology is.
Mm-hmm.
Is it just something that you've dug up from the ground, or does there have to be a date associated with that? I mean, for me, it's very difficult as well, because the plate is from a place and period that I never studied as part of my archaeology degree. So do I see it as archaeology, or do I see it as so modern that it's not? So that's a really interesting question, and I'm sure there are other people with very varied ideas of what archaeology really means.
Oh yeah, I'm sure you don't have to be definitive. This is it, and nobody else has a question. Sade, any thoughts?
Yeah, I just totally agree. I think it's a very difficult distinction to make. And I think even objects that seem quite modern to us, like our gallery is just full of casts that some of them are 200 years old, some of them are much younger. But I think it's kind of the history in which they encapsulate. So there's the history of collecting, or there's, history of kind of owning, and all of these things. And I don't know if you can really, I think lots of things are archaeology. I think if it teaches us about the past and it's material culture, I think it's got a worth. And if you call that kind of an archaeological material or not, I don't know. But I think it's all got a worth.
That's fantastic answers. Thank you. Another one is, does the Museum of Classical Archaeology have many other objects similar to the tiny head? Are there more tiny men models?
Oh, there's loads of tiny men models. There's like, we've got so lots of these figurines from Nocrautis were we've got loads of them in storage, and only 4 of them are said to be African, but there is just so many of them, and they're kind of little cult kind of votive offerings that you'd have in a domestic space. So there's loads of them. And I think most of our collection, if you kind of count it bit by bit, is kind of broken pieces of pottery that can teach you loads, and kind of broken heads and all of these different things. The casts are the thing that people come to see and draws them, but we've got so much more, and so much that can tell you about the history of the ancient world that actually dates the ancient world. Yeah.
I love both of your museums, to be honest. I could spend hours just pottering around everything. I know that what you can see only scratches the surface of what you've got, really. What else have we got? There's another one for Eleanor. Could you say something more about the idea that the plate might represent some resistance against the active discouragement of signing?
Yeah, so as I said, this is something that I'm learning about just based on the remix opportunity. And so what I had discovered from the late 1800s, that sign was basically discouraged. And so oralism, where people concentrate on breathing techniques and watching mouth movements, that was encouraged instead. And so what I've learned is that there was this kind of oppression of sign and of sign language, which seems crazy now, that affected language, would be oppressed in such a way. And it's really difficult to think about that. And so this plate, the design on the plate was registered in about 1904, and so this was still a time where sign was discouraged. And so kind of question if something is being discouraged in an official capacity, then there's still these objects that display the British Sign Language. So it's quite interesting as to this kind of both sides of this plate. And yeah, so was it resistance to this official stance? It's just questions that I also want to, find the answers to. The questions that I ask in the remix are just ones that I want to try and discover for myself. So yeah, so it's quite hard. I mean, it may be just a teaching aid, but at the same time, considering the social context, which I think is a really important thing to try and place some of these objects in, kind of wonder what was going on at the time with creating such a plate.
Great, thank you so much. I've got another question for you both, and prepare. So even though these objects are so very different from one another, do you think that there are any sort of common themes or common questions we could look at between them? Sade, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think Eleanor's already touched on it a little bit, but I think the fact is these are two quite small objects that have kind of quite compelling stories behind them. And, in a display case, they kind of are stored with alongside lots of objects and kind of less text and interpretation as a larger kind of more eye-catching object would have. And I think the fact is that even just focusing on a couple of really small objects, you can tell the stories of them underrepresented in museums. And I think that is kind of really important. And I think both of the objects show that it's totally possible to do that when you have an absence of kind of larger objects that do tell the stories, because those weren't the ones that were collected or those weren't seen as important. So yeah, I think that's a link.
I suppose in the way putting them online, sort of taking them out of the eye-catching objects actually gives them sort of a nice sort of visual prominence.
Yeah, definitely.
Add it on display. Eleanor, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think both these objects, and there are others in the Unheard project group, they kind of really have as tools to start the conversation about what's going on in society today as well. So they're not just seen as something in the past. I think they're really useful objects and tools to kind of reflect the conversations that we should be having. And so whether it's the Naucratis figure, my plate, or there's one on spectacles, there's a great one about some portraits. I think all of these are really good conversation starters for conversations that we should continue having. So I think that's a great thing that material culture in museums can really help our conversations today.
I think that's a good phrase, conversation starters. Remix will never be the be-all and end-all. These histories are so much grander than one project or one challenge. Sade, questions come in. Would your figurine have been painted?
Yes, so they're quite crude. Some of lots of these Naucratis figurines are really crude because they would have been painted with quite like a white thick coating, and then they were adorned with kind of different types of minerals and gems. So they would have been really, really bright. And the original polychrome doesn't really survive on any of them. So it's kind of interesting to know what ancient people would have seen when they looked at them, and what we're seeing when all the colour and context is taken away and we're presented with an object that wasn't actually how it appeared to the people who used it.
I can only imagine. I've got two more questions that have come in, which are actually quite related to one another. So if you guys were to remix one of the other objects in the project, which would you choose? Sade and then Eleanor, how about?
I think the bust of Queen Victoria is one that always gets me, because as they were saying in the last video, that it's one of those objects that you do just walk past and you kind of do take for granted. And there's so many interesting questions about empire and legacy and how we interpret those history that's so kind of relevant in the society today. I think that would be really exciting to kind of delve a little bit deeper and kind of get over my own kind of dismissal or preconceptions of you know, what these objects stand for and what different people see when they kind of come into contact with them. So yeah, I think it'd be the bust of Queen Victoria.
I like the idea of examining your own preconceptions whilst doing remix as well.
Definitely, yeah.
How about you, Eleanor?
I think it would be the spectacles at the Whipple, and that remix actually really spoke to me. I wouldn't even dream of leaving my house without my contacts in or my glasses because I am so short-sighted. I can't even read a book without them on, and so on a personal level that really spoke to me because I don't think about it now, but obviously if I was, I think the glasses are about 300 years old, but if I didn't have access to them, I wouldn't be able to interact with people or, it kind of, the glasses thing really spoke to me. I'd be interested in doing something on that just because I know what a blurry world it is without them. So that was really good fun. It's
amazing how sort of these simple objects can very much resonate with you as a person. And I think that's a wonderful thing that Remix is offering us, is to recontextualize these in context of how we as people, not just sort of these objects in history, they're not something that's consigned to history, they're sort of things that spoke to people of their day, if that makes sense. And that's what I really love about Remix, not to get too nerdy about it. So the related question, and we'll go in the reverse order, we'll start with you, Eleanor. What's an object that you've seen in another museum or exhibition, and it doesn't have to be UCM, that you thought someone should really remix this? Can you think of any?
Oh, that is an excellent question. Goodness, one of my favourite museums that isn't part of UCM is the Railway Museum. And there are so many stories in that museum that aren't told. When you look at the trains, you don't wonder like who made this, who drove this, who else was involved, and that's what is really great about the remix. It means you can start questioning. Well, here's the object, but who spent time and made this? And so something like that I find really interesting, very interesting, like the social history and aspects of kind of the engineering side of that I haven't really seen. I mean, the train's great, but I'd love to know more about the people, and I think that's, for me, that would be very good.
Yeah, for me, I think, I won't name the museum, but there's a museum I've been to so many times, and they've got this cabinet of curiosities, and it's filled with things from basically not England. And there's all things that like kind of really, I don't know, quite familiar to me. There's lots of like Yoruba objects and things like that. And I think even just the idea of it being a curiosity or something picked up on a trip is something that needs to kind of be explored a little bit. I think the way in which you label objects that are familiar to some people and not just weird and kind of wacky or representative of this exotic place. I think I would love to see kind of smaller collections who have these pieces that were kind of built up in the 19th century to explore kind of that a little bit more and kind of those relationships a little bit more.
Fantastic. I've got another question in actually for you, Sade, which is, what do you know about how that figurine was used?
It's quite a good one. I don't think I mentioned it in the last remix, in the video I made for Remix. They've got workshops in the Crowters where lots of these figurines are made. And I think the hood on this man and kind of the other objects we have where they kind of wear lotus headdresses tend to imply that it was a religious use. So they were kind of locally made for like local people. So I think people would have used them maybe in household shrines and things like that, because all of the remains are found in like domestic spaces rather than in temples. So I think, yeah, it was a kind of religious tool, but knowing exactly how and why it was used and what the importance of it was in kind of Egyptian or Roman Egyptian religion is very difficult to know. So it's kind of quite an open answer, I'm afraid.
No, that's good, that's good. I think sort of we're starting to wrap up now. So I've got a final question for you, which is, again, it's quite an open one. It's, if archaeology, if all of this history is just about the past, what difference does it make and how we interpret these finds? So basically, I guess the question is, why is it important to look at these objects with new and different perspectives? What's the real importance of doing this work in your minds?
Yeah. I think the fact is, history, just because history exists and people have written books about it and it's kind of common, people accept things as in a common way, and we all think of the Roman Empire as such, or history as such. I think you still have to examine that, because these kind of ideas were formulated in a time where there were, the context of them is quite impactful. Like, I think in 19th century kind of white supremacy and racial theory, emerging racial theory, does impact the way in which we see objects, and I'm sure that's the same with lots of different ways. I think in the modern world, for my object, I think people do see kind of the Roman population as white, or maybe not as multicultural, colourful as it was. And I think we do need to we have to do something to correct the ideas that people hold, and I think examining these objects is the only way to do it. I think they're quite pervasive ideas and they cling on in society. And if we just don't do anything, then we're contributing to that. And I think that's not what a museum should be doing. Yeah.
That's great. How about you, Eleanor? Any comments?
Yeah, I completely agree. We have to keep looking and we have to keep questioning ourselves. And I think that's really important. Something can't just be left in history in the past, and of course there's always things that are created or looked at in one view, but we have to keep finding other kind of ways that people view things, and the different stories that they can tell, and it's not going to be the same from for all history, and it's not going to be the same for maybe in 50 years time. People are questioning things in a completely different way than we are, and so I think it's really important that we continue to look at objects and what can we learn and what can we question and how can we talk about it and what the effects are, and looking at society and what barriers have been put in place and how we can remove those. And yeah, I think I think it will just continue to pose those questions that are really important to continue to talk about. So it shouldn't just be left there. We should continue to move forward and discuss right now.
That's brilliant. I think that's the absolute perfect note to end on, frankly. So I want to thank you both for joining me for this Q&A. It's been really wonderful chatting with you. And as I said before we started, your objects are fascinating. Your videos are great. And I'm really excited to see what people come up with in this challenge and in future challenges. So we're going to end the Q&A session there. As I said at the top of the session, we are still in the middle of challenge 2. It closes on the 5th of August, which is my birthday. Please give me remixes for my birthday present. You can check out everything on the museums.canva.ac.uk. It's the UCM website. If you have got any further questions for Sade or Eleanor, please leave a comment or a Twitter or email in, and we will do our best to get those questions to them, as long as you guys don't mind that.
Not at all.
All right, thank you so much, guys, for joining us, and we'll see you again at the next one. Goodbye.
Bye.